One of my favorite things about summer is how green everything is, and I love to bring that greenery into my home, but I don't have a green thumb, so I rely a lot on faux florals and faux greenery. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Jess, and I love to make home decor on a budget, and if you do too, then let's get started. On a recent trip to the Dollar Tree, I found these bamboo hoops at my store, which I'd seen other people haul, but this is the first that I saw them. And I had a really cool idea for a plant shelf. So I needed 2 packs of these bamboo rings, and I'm only going to use the larger rings for this project, so I'll save the smaller rings for another time. And I also need a pack of these wall shelves that you can find at the Dollar Tree. There's actually 2 in a pack, but I only need 1 for this project as well. I decided to leave both of my rings and my shelves just the natural wood color that they already were because I liked how they looked. For the rings, I took some thicker jute cord. I get this one from Walmart. It's a little thicker than the stuff that you can find at the Dollar Tree. And I just added a little hot glue to the outside of the ring, and I started wrapping the jute cord until I had about 1.5 inches wrapped, and then I double backed on itself because I wanted to make sure that there was a thicker amount of jute wrapped around this ring. So once I had about 1.5 inches wrapped around, then I went back the other direction, and so it's basically a double layer of jute that I had wrapped just in one place, and I did that on both rings. Next, I used my ruler to find the center point of the 2 longer sides on the shelf, and I used a pencil to mark where the center was. I did my best to line the jute cord up with the center points on the shelf, and then I used a piece of painter's tape to tape the 2 top pieces of the rings together, if that makes any sense, because I needed the right angle before I could glue the rings to the shelf. I added a little hot glue, and I knew this would hold well because of the texture of the rope, which is one of the reasons that I actually used the rope on there. It added a little element of decoration, and it was also functional. So once I had them tacked in place with a small amount of hot glue, then I turned the whole thing over and I added more hot glue on the bottom just to make sure that it was really secure. So the key with this is after you get that hot glue on the bottom, you have to really let it set up before you can move on to the next step. I took the painter's tape off of the top of the rings, and I'm using another piece of that thicker jute cord, and I tied it around the 2 rings, and then once I cut off a little of the excess on the shorter tail, then I used the longer tail to wrap it around the top of the rings. It's kind of hard to see at this angle, but I did start off to one side so that once I started wrapping the jute down, then the whole piece of jute would be centered on the top of the rings. Wanted to have the option of either setting this somewhere or hanging it somewhere, and since there were already holes drilled into this wall shelf, it made it really easy to be able to hang this if I wanted to. There is some white rope that comes with this wall shelf kit, but since I was using jute cord everywhere else, I decided to use the same jute that I was already using to hang this. So I strung the jute from the top down through the bottom, and then I added on a wood bead that's actually the same color as the wood in the ring and the shelf, so it all was nice and cohesive. And then I added a few knots to make sure that bead wasn't going to go anywhere. I measured out how long I think I needed the rope to be to hang it, and then I fished the other end down through on the other side. And I did the same thing. I added a bead and I tied a few knots just to make sure that everything would stay in place. And then of course I repeated that on the other side of the shelf as well. I gathered both sets of loops up towards the top of the rings, and I made sure that there was a good amount of tension on the strings coming from the shelves. And you'll be able to see here in a minute that my loops actually weren't the same length, and that's okay. I was able to make some adjustments later so that I could still hang it if I wanted to. I used another piece of jute just to help tie those 2 pieces together, and I made sure that I tied it in a double knot to make it really secure. I took all 4 strands that were coming up from the shelf and I tied one big knot as far up as I could. Now, because I had one loop that was slightly shorter than the other, I tied the knot up as high as I could where that shorter loop was, and then once I had my knot in place, I just clipped off the shorter of the 2 loops and added just a tiny amount of hot glue to make sure that that rope wasn't going to go anywhere. And once the glue was all set and dried, you couldn't see that there was another piece of rope tucked down in there. And then I just cut off the extra tails of that piece of jute that tied the 2 loops together. I don't always do this, but this jute cord that I was using seemed to be awfully fuzzy, so I took a lighter and I just lightly went over each of the jute cords just to burn off some of those extra fuzzy pieces. I had this really pretty blue jar on hand from the Dollar Tree last year, I believe. So I added that to the center of the shelf, and then I just tucked in a few of my favorite pieces of greenery. I saw this macrame wall hanging on the Target website and I knew I could recreate it with Dollar Tree items. So I grabbed one of the round signs that they always seem to carry at the Dollar Tree, and I started by trying to find the center point of the sign and drawing a pencil line so that I could cut it. I had to get out my cutting mat to finally find the center because, as you can see, I had 2 other attempts there and I knew they weren't centered, but the cutting mat really helped me find the center in the end. So one tip I have for cutting through these MDF signs from the Dollar Tree is when you're using your utility knife, don't try to press too hard. Just use like maybe a medium pressure as you're going down and go down through it several times, and then you'll be able to start a groove with your blade, and then you can go back through and keep going lightly over that same groove. It's better to do it several times and then kind of crack it in half rather than trying to use the blade to cut through the whole thing all in one shot. I am going to be using both halves of the circle for this project, but I only needed to paint one of them. So I gave one half of the circle 2 coats of the mineral color by Waverly. Once my paint was dry, I took some of the white nautical rope from the Dollar Tree and I separated it out into the 3 strands that it's twisted into so that I could just use one strand at a time. Now, the circle that you're seeing here is the back side of the one that I had painted, and you can see once I had the 3 strands separated, I kind of fanned out the edges a little before I glued it down onto my sign. I cut my rope really long to start. It was way longer than what I needed. I think I ended up cutting about 20-inch lengths. But for the project that I'm doing, I really probably could have just did about 12-inch lengths. But whatever length you decide to leave your rope is up to you. If you want a little longer of a look, you could leave it as long as you wanted to. But in the end, it was actually a lot easier to use the shorter length, so I wish I had cut them slightly shorter to start. So once I had the first 2 ropes in place, I went ahead and I just continued the whole way across. I kept cutting lengths of rope, separating out the 3 pieces, fanning out the top, and gluing it towards the bottom of the half circle. Once all of the ropes were glued down onto the half circle, I ran another bead of hot glue across the top of the ropes just to make sure that there weren't any loose ends. And then I took the other half of the circle and I used hot glue on the side that had the print on it, and then I just laid it over top of the ropes and the other half circle. I needed to separate out the strands even farther on these ropes, so I started by hand and I just started untwisting them as best as I could just with my hands. And then once I had them untwisted as much as I could, I went back in with one of the pet brushes that you can find at the Dollar Tree, and I just started brushing out the individual strands that form the nautical rope. I forgot to hit record, but to create the rounded shape on the fringes, I just laid another circle on top of it, and then I used my rotary cutter to cut around the outside so that it would be pretty even across the bottom. I think one of the best ways to find a good deal on greenery is to look at the greenery garlands that they sell at places like Hobby Lobby and Michael's. They usually have them on sale. I got this one from Hobby Lobby. The original price was $19.99, but I believe the day that I bought it, it was 40% off. And for how much greenery you get in it, I think it's a really good deal. I cut one length that was about the same width as the circle that I was using, and then I hot glued that down in place, and then I used a couple other pieces just to fill in where I thought it was maybe a little sparse so that it would look nice and full. When I saw these little faux drawers with the label holder on the front at Dollar Tree, I knew it would make a really cute plant holder. This one's going to be really easy. I'm just going to take one of those drawers, a terracotta pot, some beads, and some jute. So for the terracotta pot, you could leave it plain if you wanted to, but I decided to dry brush some of the elephant color by Waverly all over the outside. I think anytime that you can add little feet to a project, it just makes it look a little more high-end. I already had these gray wooden beads on hand, and since they match the elephant color pretty well, I decided to glue one in each corner of the bottom of that box. I'm using that thicker jute twine again, and I decided to wrap it around 2 times right where that little ledge is on the terracotta pot. And then after I had that in place, I made a simple shoelace bow out of the same jute and glued it to the pot. I also hot glued 2 of the tumbling tower blocks to the bottom of the terracotta pot just so that it would rise up inside of the box a bit more and you could see more of the pot. Since there is a little label holder on the front of this box, I cut a small piece of cardstock to fit inside, and then I just wrote the word hi with a little heart because I just thought that was really cute, but you could write whatever you want or leave it blank. To finish off this little planter, I added some river rock into the terracotta pot, and then I cut off a piece of a smaller succulent and added that to the center. Thanks for hanging out in the craft room with me today. You'll have to let me know in the comments how you like to decorate for summer. I left some videos on the screen that I think you might like. I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you in the next one.